Hello, thank you everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Strategic Learnings to Building Long-Term Resilience. I'm Kim Baldoni, Chief Marketing Officer at Surefire Cyber, and I'll be your host and moderator today. Today I'm joined by Michelle Lopilato, Head of Distribution at Converge, David Emerson, Chief Technology Officer at SolCyber, and Matt Dowling, Director of Digital Forensics and Incident Response at Surefire Cyber. I'm going to be talking to David, Michelle, and Matt about real-world insights and practical advice on reducing cyber risk. But before we get started, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. All participants in today's session will be on mute, except for the presenters. We are recording this session, so at the end of the event, we'll be emailing out a link to the recording as well as posting it on social. And if you have any questions, please type it into the Q&A. We're going to be handling questions at the end of the session. So if you type it in the Q&A at the end, we'll run through the questions that are asked of the presenter. So let's get started. Thank you, Matt, David, and Michelle. Thank you for joining us all today. It's exciting to have you here. So my first question that I have, over the last few years, we've seen a lot of changes in the cyber insurance marketplace. We've seen ransomware increase, prices increase, and the way that insureds go about getting insurance as well has quite possibly, changed. What I'd like to throw out to you is, what have we seen over the last few years in the buying process for cyber insurance for small to medium-sized businesses?
So Kim, first of all, thanks for having me here. I will say that the past few years have been a significant game changer for SMBs. And just for some context, when cyber first came out as a product in the insurance community, they required a voluminous application, an engineering call, and a third-party assessment just to secure a cyber policy. Fast forward, when cyber insurance became a very viable growth opportunity, the influx of insurance carriers offering cyber created a very competitive and soft marketplace. Great for buyers, right? And the pendulum had literally gone from way over here and swung the other way. And it got to the point that securing a cyber policy was so easy that all SMBs had to do was provide their name, their address, their website, and their annual revenues. And they got a policy. No security requirements necessary, no self-assessment, no engineering call, very little underwriting. Honestly, it was like the Oprah Winfrey Show a little bit. You get a policy, you get a policy, everybody gets a policy. It was that easy. But that ended. It all changed with COVID, a remote workforce, and a huge increase in ransomware attacks. So there again, the pendulum swung back the other way, and we now have a far more stringent underwriting process. And when that happened, if an SMB didn't have MFA in place, no policy. A claim in the past 12 months, no policy. Lacks backups, no policy. So it was really a very just dire change for SMBs. They were not prepared for it, and they didn't have a lot of these controls in place. So now we're at a place where the baseline for SMBs seeking insurance now assumes that MFA is being deployed, managed detection and response is being used, remote desktop protocols are closed or shored up, there's strong backups, disaster recovery, they're in place, they're being tested. Security training is being given to all employees and on a quarterly basis. So there's a lot more hurdles now that SMBs have to get past. So the buying process certainly changed quite a bit. And that's where we are right now.
Thanks, Michelle. Matt or David, is there anything that you'd like to add here? Because, my biggest question with this is, it sounds like there's a lot of security controls they have to have in place. And one of the biggest factors is, well, how do they validate these? What's happening in this process? If the carrier is asking for these controls, how are they validating these controls that they are in place and in place correctly? And, is it you don't get insurance if you have them, if you don't have them in place? Or, what can you do to validate them and then lower your premium and actually obtain the coverage?
Yeah. Well, like Michelle said, a lot of organizations, they're taking action. They're following a checklist. That checklist came from the insurer typically. And it's part of underwriting, but it's important that the organizations realize that checklist is an actuarial necessity. It's not a comprehensive defense framework. If you check all the boxes on it, it's not the same as hardening your environment. even if it seems difficult to do that. And so ultimately, it might not represent the comprehensive risk transfer that you believe it to be on account of poor risk management, poor validation in your operations. What do you do about that? Well, you get a framework. NIST CSF is a good one. Your tax dollars pay for it. So start there, and then you get some tools that address the controls in your chosen framework, and then you build some processes, and you get some people to implement those tools and processes. This is not easy. Success is not guaranteed. It's necessary if you want to support the risk transfer you expected, and if you actually want to manage your risk. And it's ultimately the reason that SolCyber created foundational coverage. It's the people and the tools and the processes and the business needs at a baseline to comprehensively secure itself, built from the ground up to complement your insurance, to complement your IR team. It's why we're on this panel.
So you talked about a number of security controls. I've heard both of you as far as email security, multi-factor authentication, but we all know that either they're still not getting implemented or they may not necessarily be implemented in the right way. And, we can't forget human error. We can train and train and train all we want, but, someone is still going to click on that link in your organization. I've got to imagine we're seeing the same type of incidents still over and over. Are we seeing the same type of incidents over and over with all these security controls in place? And if so, what are we seeing, and what are the key takeaways that we can take, that the clients can take away from this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thanks Kim for that. So there's a number of different pieces here. I would love to say that email phishing and user security awareness is the boogeyman that keeps companies up at night. But the truth of the matter is, while those incidents do represent and can cause financial loss, the big hitters, the ransomware incidents, et cetera, are really coming from the repeated and preventable incidents. So stuff like, poor implementation of legacy security controls, inconsistent deployment of security software. So that's like your EDR, AV, antivirus, or multi-factor authentication. So making sure that those aren't blanketed, right? Everybody has those controls in place, or just exceptions made from leadership. So something like, antivirus on this system is slowing down our processes, which is causing us financial loss. Just take it off that system. We want it gone, right? You're causing us an issue. Instead of working through the problem, troubleshooting it, and coming up with a solution that properly secures these. I do have a couple real world examples of these. One of them, first one is a project we did not too long ago. It was a zoo, actually. So the client was essentially migrating from a fully patched 2013 Exchange server to a 2019 server. So 2013 super old, they're going to the new one, makes sense. They had installed everything on the 2019 server. They were getting processes set up to migrate over to this system, and they installed patches before they installed Exchange. What happened here was when they went live, they had a vulnerable Exchange instance on there. They did no testing prior to this, and wound up a situation where the same day that they went live with the new latest and greatest, at the time at least, Exchange server, they were compromised within hours, right? Which led to a ransomware incident and significant financial loss. And the client here, they did everything right besides that point. They had EDR on every single endpoint. They had pretty good patching across the board. They had good security monitoring. They had pretty well defense in depth. The unfortunate piece was one little mistake on this one system caused a massive incident, which realistically, brought their company down for a significant amount of time and caused them some serious harm. So it's important when you're thinking about bringing these environments up, or as you're testing things, and making sure that you're testing for everything. You're testing for vulnerabilities before you bring systems online. You're assessing that risk, because something that seemingly is small, right? Missing an update for a day, to most people is like, oh, it's not a big deal, we'll take care of that tomorrow. But in this case here, that one day of missing that problem caused them a serious financial loss. And that's kind of similar to some of the points we talked about earlier, right? If you're talking about that questionnaire from the insurance underwriters to get that policy, how are you how are you handling that? How are you testing for those things? Is it widely deployed across all users, or is MFA on most of your users, but we have this one user that doesn't want to use it, or they're a special user like an executive that just refuses, so you don't have that one user with MFA. How do you answer that questionnaire? Is it true or false? And get the policy. I do have another example. This one's a little bit different here in the sense that it was more of a breakdown of how they handle incidents or their preparedness for an incident, which led to some really miscoordinations, arguments between senior leadership and their technical teams, as well as just lots of 2 step forwards, 1 step backs throughout the process. So, the client experienced a ransomware incident. They didn't really know what they wanted to do, or how to handle that or how to respond to that. So they took a couple days trying to figure that out before they even reported it to their insurance carrier. Once that happened, you got the incident response involved, the attorneys involved to help with the process. But still, they weren't moving very far. They didn't really understand where their backups were, what was backed up. They didn't really understand what systems were critical, right? What did they need to bring up first? And these lacks of preparedness caused them weeks of downtime where they were expecting, and what they had assessed as part of their policy actually is they could be restored back up in 72 hours, right? They ran into an incident, 72 hours, they'd be restored, fully operational, and that was certainly not the case here. There was severe gaps in what was actually being backed up, lots of critical data not being backed up, which ultimately resulted them in having to pay a ransom, which was something they were not expecting as well. So takeaway here is, a lot of companies have an IR plan, right? There's a lot of frameworks, there's a lot of requirements around that, from regulatory reasons to just standard good practice. What I see companies doing less is testing that policy or that plan in a way that is meaningful, right? So when you're actually in a ransomware incident, making sure that, or any incident for that matter, making sure that everybody knows their part. This person is contacting insurance. Okay, great. You're shutting down the systems. I've been in environments where the IT guy freaks out and unplugs everything and has no idea where to plug it back in, which causes a massive delay in bringing systems back up. It's just it's scary, and not to bring an analogy into it, but I kind of liken it to having a kid, right? When you get pregnant, you don't just show up at the hospital 9 months later, right? There's a lot of preparedness to get involved in that, right? What doctor you're going to have. You go to Lamaze classes to figure out what to expect in that situation. You know exactly where you're going to park, right? You know exactly the parents, the in-laws, they're going to watch your other kid while you're going. There's a whole coordination taking place for this entire thing. You don't just wing it. That creates lots of chaos. And same thing with a cyber incident. You don't want chaos. You want it to be calm. You want it to be measured. You want to make sure you're making the right decisions, because one wrong decision, particularly early on, can cause weeks of delay of restoration, which is tragic.
I think that's one of the biggest problems that we see for organizations. They think they create their incident response plan, it's done, they put it on the shelf, and we'll utilize it if and when the time comes. But what everyone needs to consider is it's a living document. It should be reviewed continually. Members of your incident response team change, and it should be tested, and not just tested one and done, but tested each year. Is there any other things that we can tell, small to medium-sized businesses, any lessons that we've learned from these or other incidents, adjustments that they can be doing to their businesses, or things they can be doing to make sure they don't see them in the same situation again and again?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing we see with companies in the SMB space, right, is they kind of outgrow their technology, right? They start off as a 10-person shop, then they have 15, then they have 20. And once you start getting up in those numbers, it's really hard to manage an environment of 25, 30, 40 employees as it is to manage, 10 computers and a whole new wall office. So as you start to expand, you have to expand your technology, you have to expand your processes as well. So there are ways to do this. And realistically, a company of that size may not be able to hire, IT architecture guy, right? So a server guy that's going to maintain your server environment. They may not be able to hire a support guy to help your users when they can't print their documents or figure out, an issue with their password. May not be able to afford a security guy, and realistically, 3 or 4, because you have rotations, because who's watching overnight, who's watching weekends, who's watching holidays. And that's where I think companies actually like SolCyber, where they have kind of that full security stack piece there, where you can get in and have a company that has really good experience, a third party helping you out with really good experience at a much more affordable price mark, than bringing in your own experts that can really provide that advice across the entire marketplace as well. So having third parties help you out is really a way to kind of manage that risk, transfer some of that risk, right? And also ensure that you're being up to date with all the latest threats and the latest intel from a company that's doing it across many different, vectors and industries.
Thank you, Matt. So, it's you. I want to pick upon something you said. You talked about transferring the risk. David talked earlier about preventative steps that companies can take. You've talked about if and when the plan, if and when a breach has happened, but, that risk transfer. Michelle, I'd be interested, because at one point in time you said that pendulum switched and everyone got cyber insurance, and everyone had a policy and it was easy, and you gave 5 pieces of information and your policy was issued. And that pendulum switched again. I've got to imagine many businesses were turned off on getting cyber insurance, or thinking they could not get cyber insurance. Would you say now, are there misconceptions and concerns for small businesses about going into that process now as that pendulum has switched? And, what are some of the conversations that you're having with clients so that they really understand, like, yes, there's been a change in how to get coverage, but this is the importance. What are some of those conversations that you're having now?
So, let me first just by saying, in the past few years, post-COVID, post-ransomware losses, business email compromise losses, even the smallest of the SMBs we work with are actually far more educated and sophisticated than they were prior to a lot of these losses, right? They are learning very hard lessons through this type of crisis, whether it's paying ransom in cryptocurrency, businesses being stopped in their tracks, to double ransoms, to recreating their data assets, or dealing with privacy compliance, even incident response. That wasn't even a term SMBs were using regularly, but now most not only understand it, many are working with partners like Surefire to create those IR plans to mitigate potential losses. So I think that there was a lot of learning that was going on. So there are things that we can talk about and that they're far more up to speed on. But having said that, there are still SMBs that are focused solely on their cybersecurity. And that's good, but it's not enough. I tell clients that it's a 3-step process, right? It's prevention, mitigation, and transfer. You want to prevent through cybersecurity controls, working with SolCyber, shoring up all your defenses, making sure you have best-in-class securities in place. It's mitigation, whether it's through the incident response plans that you're creating with Surefire, backup plans, disaster recovery, and then ultimately transferring your financial risk off the balance sheet and onto a cyber insurance policy. Essentially, you want to ensure that you're able to keep your business up and running when you have that type of crisis event. And it's not just that an insurance policy will pay, but they'll also step in to coordinate the response to this crisis event. And I think this is where some of the misconception comes in, and what a policy does and how it works. And I can tell you that at Converge, when a claim occurs, we have a 24/7, 365 hotline that you can call, whether you suspect you've had a breach or you actually know you've had a breach. That's going to trigger a privacy attorney to help you navigate the patchwork of privacy laws, both in the United States and the rest of the world. That privacy attorney will help direct the greater response, really step in and take over, because this is a crisis event where many SMBs have not been through. They don't understand what they're supposed to do, who to call and when. So, that breach coach, that privacy attorney, whether they are working with Surefire to really, contain, investigate, and remediate that breach, bringing in a PR team to help mitigate the reputational harm, setting up a call center, credit monitoring for those affected. the reality is you won't be left holding the bag. You won't be left trying to understand who to contact next. That, to me, that is the real value for policyholders. And that, I think, is something that many SMBs don't understand. They're not just buying a policy that's going to write a check and reimburse them for expenses. It's going to step in and help them coordinate the response to this type of a breach.
Would you say, are you still having to explain that process? Are you finding that SMBs, they're kind of understanding that more and more? I look at that. You had mentioned, the technology is enough, and maybe this kind of dovetails into a bigger question. You talked about these partnerships that you have with SolCyber. Do companies know that they can benefit from coming to you? We brought you all on here today, and you've mentioned working with each other. How does a client benefit from that? And what does that relationship look like when a client comes to one of your companies, and how can they benefit from this partnership versus just going into, the open marketplace?
There are a number of ways, and I'm sure that Matt and David can speak to many as well. I will just start off by saying that, Converge is working and very happy to be working with Surefire and SolCyber on a couple of different fronts. First of all, the partnership that we have with SolCyber is really that next step that's needed to connect the dots between good cyber hygiene and competitive premiums for using those best-in-class controls. And it's, in my experience, what's been missing in the commercial insurance marketplace. I would talk to customers all the time. They're like, we're doing all these great things, but we're not seeing any premium relief. And we think that we should be. And so that's what we're really trying to do, is make sure that we're connecting those dots. So Converge is really able to offer a fully bespoke insurance policy to SolCyber's customers based on the security stack that's being implemented. We've already worked with SolCyber. We've kicked the tires. We understand that these are best-in-class controls that impact our underwriting very favorably. So the foundational coverage that SolCyber is offering makes their customers a much better risk. And we're able, in turn, to reward those customers with better than market rates. So that's something that I think is a huge benefit for customers working with SolCyber that they're not going to see in the regular commercial marketplace. And then, conversely, working with Surefire, when there's a breach, our partnership with Surefire ensures that our policyholders have immediate access to the teams to contain, to investigate, to remediate the loss. Getting policyholders back up and back to business faster and more securely. It's an enormous benefit. And again, something that if you have not been through one of these crisis events, you don't have a partner, this is something that is going to benefit you greatly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Matt and David, how have you worked together? Once a client has an incident, what does that look like for someone and a client, and how do they benefit?
Yeah, so I'd say we meet clients on the worst day of their professional life, right? When we come in there, it's really tragic, right? And the issue with that is, a lot of times they're meeting us for the first time. And, there's this instant credibility of, okay, the insurance carrier or somebody else brings you in and has you, essentially, we trust them, they're on our panel, we've tested them, we worked with them a lot. And, there's some level of trust, but you still have to build that piece up. And I found working with, obviously, SolCyber in many of their services helps supplement a lot of the response capabilities and really enables the client to feel good when they're going through response. So for instance, if we're investigating the incident, we're rebuilding the environment, while SolCyber is, for instance, monitoring that environment and also building up their security capabilities and throwing in a full security stack during that time, it really helps them feel like they're making progress. They're not just getting back to normal, they're, improving some of their security stack, or at least having good eyes in that aspect. I mean, obviously there's the idea of betterment versus not, right? But there's the side of taking a look and making sure that the environment is safe while they're getting back to normal, which is a huge improvement. And having partners that can help with that makes it all the easier and gives us that peace of mind as we're going through this, and obviously the clients as well. And
we usually see customers on like the 15th worst day of their lives. So, after after Surefire's done their work, they're usually much better off. But now they need to figure out how not to squander the lesson they've just learned. Life teaches other businesses lessons that you can learn for free as well. So don't assume that you have to be breached in order to know these things. But I think that there's a couple of sort of aspects of this ecosystem that work really well together. One of them is that the coverage that you can consistently and comprehensively implement is better than any complex, sophisticated program that you might imagine you can implement. And what's really consistent is math. So risk transfer by way of insurance. And what's also really consistent is knowing that you've got someone on retainer if something does happen, acknowledging the fact that something will happen. And likewise, a managed program, which is what typically my team offers. And then the second thing that I think really benefits customers from this relationship is the defense in depth configuration that represents these three, aspects of the service. There are defense in depth configurations in a technical sense, right? Primary mitigations have backstops. The finance team does peer review. Anti-malware is backed by a DNS filter. But having Surefire backed by SolCyber, having SolCyber backed by Converge, and so on in a recirculating manner, this is a lot more effective than any competent single defense. So there's defense in depth in this configuration as well.
Thank you, David. We've heard a number of lessons here. We've heard a lot of situations that rates have increased, security controls have been implemented, control validation for obtaining cyber insurance. We talked about here. Are there any other lessons learned that we can give businesses, small and medium-sized businesses or business leaders to help them in this prevention, mitigation, and risk transfer process? But also, with these lessons, how can they align their cyber, how can they align their efforts with their organization's financial capabilities? Because it sounds like a lot here, and it sounds like, well, this may cost a lot. How can they properly align that with achieving their organizational cybersecurity controls and goals?
So I'll jump in here on the prevention, mitigation, the risk transfer. I mean, I think it goes without saying, it's a three-legged stool. If you're missing any one of these legs, the stool's going to fall over, right? And I'll give you a real world example of that. I previously had a manufacturing client who chose to self-insure his risk. He relied very heavily on his backup plans. He invested a lot of money in there, and that was fine. So we didn't place insurance with him. Unfortunately for him, the business did suffer a ransomware attack. Out of principle, he chose not to pay the ransom, disconnected, and began restoring his data via the backups. And I will say, all of the data was restored with the exception of 2 weeks. And those 2 weeks were the last 2 weeks of his fiscal year. That meant he was not able to close out his financial year end. He had to redirect all his employees to recreate the data. They were pulling invoices, they were reviewing inventory, they were reading through emails, et cetera, et cetera. And the business ended up being disrupted for a solid 3 weeks. Now, his choice to self-insure came at a cost of about $300,000. That didn't include the cost to investigate or remediate the breach. This was just to close out those 2 weeks of the business for the year. Now, had he transferred that risk to a cyber policy, these expenses would have been covered and it wouldn't have hit the balance sheet. So, I mean, I think when you're talking about how to align everything and your expenses and what you're paying, the expense for an insurance policy, the expense to, plan and mitigate these things through an incident response plan, the expense to have the best cyber securities and controls in place are going to be far less than that cost you have when you have a breach. So for me, it's a really easy answer. Making sure that you're hitting all three of these steps, you will not spend the money that you would spend when you have the outcome, the worst outcome.
A lot of customers come to us with a myopia, kind of like a sort of single-minded focus on their product, and that I don't know what that industrial customer did, but let's just say they made threaded rod. They might think that they only make threaded rod, but the reality is they make threaded rod in an ecosystem of competitors and customers and the incompetent and malicious actors. They make threaded rod on Earth, not in a vacuum. And so risk is strategic, right? Like you have to frame it that way to yourself, or you're never going to solve this problem because you're going to think it's other, right? It's not threaded rod, it's cybersecurity. But it is strategic. And between the folks represented on this panel and response, maintenance, and transfer, you have the tools that would enable you to manage that risk if you chose to manage it actively. So my advice as a specialist in risk management is to actually manage your risk strategically. Like, don't just think of it as other.
Yeah, and we talked about it a little bit before, but IR plan, testing that IR plan, and being prepared for what's to come, right? And I think that's the theme of a lot of this, right? Is transferring the risk and being prepared. IR retainer is a great way, right? Often, couples in with doing that IR testing, IR planning. You're also meeting the team prior to an incident. So you're not just kind of meeting at the inception of this on your worst day, and now that team is learning your environment while also trying to secure your environment, while also trying to investigate what's going on with your environment. There's some tribal knowledge that's already learned by your IR team when you kind of enter into a retainer type agreement, which really could help speed things up, especially on that outset, which, as I mentioned previously, that outset and decisions made early on can really speed things up or slow things down, in the end.
Thank you all. Well, what I'm going to do is, that was the questions that I had for today. What I'm going to do is open it up for Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, please type them in the chat and we'll go through them. I'll just throw them out to the group. I've got quite a few here. The first one is, what are the considerations and challenges that you're seeing for growing companies and how they keep pace with security and processes? So I would say here, as you go from a smaller business and increase in size, what are some of the considerations and challenges that you see for these companies to keep up with this, managing the risk as they're managing their growth?
I can take that one. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges I see is the program risk. It's imaginable how one would build a cybersecurity program, a mounted response to risk that is defined pretty well by the market, ransomware and so on. But the reality of doing that, the reality of recruiting, the reality of self-insuring, if that's what you're choosing to attempt, it's very, very risky. And ultimately, there's a risk that not only do you spend more money than you thought, but also the risk that it actually doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen effectively, which is far more expensive than merely spending a little more money than you thought. So I would say that's kind of the number one consideration is fundamentally the project risk of pulling all of this together yourself.
Next question. Thank you, David. What are some of the low-hanging fruit, or the mitigation steps to make your organization cyber secure? We've talked about a lot of things here, and for some businesses, that's not their focus. Their focus is the product they're making or the service that they run. Where do you even start? And what are some of the fundamentals that a small to medium-sized business MB can tackle in order to get started?
Yeah, so I mean, I can take that from a cyber side, at least from what we're seeing from an incident piece. I mean, a lot of the attacks we're seeing, I'd say almost a majority of them, are very simple. They're not these super complicated, methods that threat actors are launching 0 days. I mean, they do happen, but the most of it is, you open remote desktop protocol to the internet, right? And you forgot about it. It's been there for years. You don't use it, and that gets compromised. Or you have VPN without multi-factor authentication, or like we mentioned before, that one user that didn't have it, that you thought had it, and that just happened to be the user that got hit. So what you can do is kind of look at security best practices. It was mentioned before. I think David mentioned the NIST CSF. That's a great starting point to kind of go through those controls and see, okay, what can I apply quickly to my organization, or what can I, where can I pull out of this? Can I look at my external footprint and what don't I need? And from what I do need, how can I secure that down, right? How can I make sure that the controls such as MFA, such as, keeping systems patched, not allowing traffic in that's not needed in, right? Making sure the firewall's configured properly. Those are things you can, for the most part, mitigate over a weekend, right? Updating systems, closing down ports you don't need, and implementing MFA. So those things will really help bring the cost to compromise an environment up.
David, I turn to Matt. Matt and both of you as a follow-up to that question. Are there services, what services do each of your firms offer that can provide, that can start tackling those? If I'm an SMB and I'm coming to you and I've got this list, how can I start working with each of your companies to kind of get started on tackling those?
I mean, just engagement honestly offers a framework. And when Surefire works with their customers, I mean, even before a breach, hopefully, they do things like tabletop exercises that drive engagement, right? When Converge works with customers, they do things like sending them a questionnaire. I mean, that it sounds simple, but a lot of people haven't thought about the things on that questionnaire. There might be resources implicit in engaging with any of the businesses on this call. That it could be legal resources that Michelle mentioned, or technical resources at SolCyber or whatnot. Engagement drives awareness to some extent. You probably never thought about your inventory that hard until you realized you don't have a very good one when Surefire starts asking questions. So I think that's a major benefit. It's an indirect benefit, but it's a major benefit of engaging with any of the companies on this call. In a direct sense, of course, there are procedural benefits. There's a package stack that you can deploy. There's a packaged risk transfer product that you can purchase. But those are tactical. They're obvious. I think the implicit benefit is somewhat less obvious.
Yeah, and just to tackle onto that, I mean, engagement is exactly it, right? The first step is picking up the phone. The first step is sending that email to get involved. We're partnering with many insurance carriers on doing ransomware readiness assessments, and that's something where, we're taking a look at what are these very common attack vectors that threat actors are using, what are these lateral movement vectors, privilege escalation vectors that threat actors are using, and are you vulnerable to those? Are you susceptible to that type of attack? Or do you have the capability to see when those attack methods are being used? Many of them are standard stuff that people do on day to day, but do you have someone like SolCyber in monitoring and checking to see if these privilege escalation tactics are being leveraged and using a stack like that? And do you have that ability to see that? And those things are really helpful as well to help figure out where your risks lie and how you solve those.
That's great. Thank you both. And then we've got another questions come through here. What preparation steps can I take to shorten my response time? And if I work with an incident response firm, what do I need in place? So Michelle, with or without insurance, I would say, how do I work with an incident response firm if we could look at it with insurance and without insurance? And then is there anything I do if I have an incident that I can shorten my response time? So it's kind of 3 questions in there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm going to start with if you have an insurance policy, the good news with Converge is that, you have access to Surefire, you have access to these post-breach vendors that know what they're doing. This is what they do, all day long, 24/7, 365, right? They're the professionals at this. Surefire knows how to respond to these because they haven't just seen it once. They've seen these ransomware gangs. They've seen these types of attacks and these types of, coming through these vectors. They know how to stop the bleeding, right? And remediate this. And that's important. And that's a part of the policy, right? That is a benefit as a policy holder. If you don't have an insurance policy, I would recommend getting one because, we're doing the hard work for you. We're vetting these vendors on your behalf. Because if you're left going through the, old school phone book, the online, whoever it is you're trying to find out, whether it be word of mouth, who's good at what they do. And maybe it's, maybe it's a friend of a friend, and maybe it's a smaller office that hasn't really seen a lot of these types of events. You're going to be doing an awful lot of homework, and you may not end up with the partner that you need. We've already done that. Like I said, we're working with the best in class vendors. Surefire has done this. They do it all the time. And that is going to benefit you in the long run because you're going to be able to get your business back up and back to business sooner because they know all the steps to take. So I think that that's important. Don't go it alone. You know, David had said this is strategic. Make sure that you are addressing this, the prevention, the mitigation, the risk transfer from all sides, all stakeholders. You're including the C-suite, the CISO, the risk manager, whatever your company's counterparts are. Have everyone in that discussion. Make sure that you're asking questions if you don't know the answers, because it's only going to benefit you in the event that you have this type of breach. You know, and one of the questions I would tell you that you should ask from the insurance side of the house is, if you have cyber insurance, what does it look like? Is it a standalone policy that's very robust that is going to give you all of these policyholder benefits? Or is it a throw-in coverage or an endorsement on your business owner's property policy or your package policy or maybe on your management liability policy? If that's the case, you're only getting a very small piece of insurance. You're only getting a small piece of risk transfer. So someone might say, yeah, we have cyber, but they don't have a full robust policy. So when you have this breach event, you may be very unfortunately surprised that you don't have the coverage that you think that you have. So I think that having those discussions with all stakeholders and really asking the questions and getting to the meat of everything is going to benefit you in the long run.
Just saying, that's a great point. Like, what type of cyber coverage do I have? Because I think you're right. Big misconception is a lot of businesses think, well, I have cyber, but cyber doesn't. Not all cyber insurance policies look the same.
No, they are not created equal. They are not industry standard forms, and they can be put in a lot of different places, but unless it's a standalone policy, you're very likely not getting the coverage you are expecting.
That's a great takeaway. Matt, you had to add on as well. Thank you.
Yeah, just some thoughts on the preparedness, for an organization. So obviously having insurance involved, and I know working with a lot of your insurance carriers in Converge as well, they have a panel of pre-approved vendors, right, that they work with. Requesting even a meet and greet with someone from the panel, to understand, all right, these are the people I'm going to be working with, right? So you get to kind of step out of the way, you have some familiarity. I mean, those things are really good. But even beyond that, understanding your own environment to a level that, okay, let's pretend, just do a whiteboard session. All right, here's my environment, here's all my important stuff. What if this one goes away? How do we do that, right? Responding to an incident isn't, you're stopped and then you're running, right? It's you're stopped, you now need to learn how to crawl again, now you need to walk, and now you need to run. So crawling is bringing back those critical services and maybe nothing else. So how do I transfer those services? What are some pieces? You have a phone system. Okay. Is there a way that I can transfer my phone to a cell phone, right? Or something along those lines as a short gap so I can take in calls and I can continue to work. It's better to prepare for these things ahead of time instead of doing it live and figuring out an option and working with your phone vendor and figuring out that stuff. So understanding what's important for your organization to get to the crawl stage, and also knowing, what backups you have, when they're from, the whole process of that, and checking them immediately, because that's all going to come into play as we get to the response side of things. What do we have? What is our plan? Because that plan may be a moving target, but being as prepared as you can, understanding everything as early as you can, really will decrease the response time and increase your readiness for that.
So it definitely sounds, one of the takeaways here is, if you're applying for insurance and you're getting these supplemental questions, don't just answer them and ignore them, but understand them and the importance of them and how they're going to relate to if and when you have the incident response to and how it will work with your forensic provider. Because it sounds like a lot of those are your preparation steps to shorten your response time, is understanding why the carrier is asking for those questions. Well, that's it for the questions that we've got today. I'd like you to open it up. Michelle, David, and Matt, thank you all for your time. Is there anything else that you'd like to add or close with today before we wrap up?
Do something. Manage this actively. That's my number one advice.
That's a great piece of advice. Well, what I'd like to do is thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for our presenters, Matt, David, and Michelle, for your time. We'll be sending around a recording to the webinar after this event, as well as posting it online. But if you have any additional follow-up questions, or if you'd like to reach anyone at SolCyber, Surefire Cyber, Converge, please reach out to us on our websites and we can talk about cybersecurity, incident response, and cyber insurance. But I'd like to thank you all for your time today, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining.